Welcome to another episode of Health Your Way podcast, where we discuss health issues ranging from physical, mental, emotional, as well as current facts. Today, we're going to be discussing grief does not exclude men. And my guest, Kirsten Frey, who is a transformation life coach, an advanced certified grief recovery specialist. Today, we really want to dive into, some of the issues men deal with, some of the stuff that we women do not know or don't acknowledge, and some of the and just a basic understanding that men do grief, even though they may not show it. We need to be open and we need to actually acknowledge it. So I really want to say thank you for reaching out to me and, joining me in this conversation. So I'm saying hi, girl.
Hi, Mo. It's so great to be with you again. I really appreciate this opportunity. And honestly, this platform for opening up this discussion for men is so important, especially now. Like it just really is. And I think as we're heading into the winter and holiday seasons, I think when we can touch in with one another and really be open and aware as to what might be going on for people, including the men in our lives, and how we can actually help with that, how we can have a greater awareness on how grief affects the men in our lives as well.
You say that, and I think of my boyfriend, and I'm just like, you know what? I remember when we were first dealing with the whole COVID-19, and I couldn't understand. Like I was dealing with my own issues. Like everybody was dealing with the new normal to a certain extent. And then I think he was losing a part of his identity, and he was trying to figure himself out. And I think he had a grief section that no longer working for a sec, and no longer having that identity with the gym or something, trying to find something. So you're right. I think we just lose track that they grieve, but it's differently.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that it's not that they grieve differently necessarily. Well, you know what? It's interesting. Men grieve just this. Men grieve just like women do because
Okay.
we are all human and we all have human emotions. And the thing is, I thought it was really important what you said about the loss of identity that he had when there was a change in his familiar work pattern. And so that is grief. Most of us attribute grief to the normal and natural feelings we have with a loss of any kind. And most of us attribute that to a death or a divorce or losing a relationship. But grief is also all the conflicting feelings that we have around an end of or a change in our familiar patterns of behavior. So when we lose work, when we can no longer work in the way that we've been trained to do so, it's a loss of identity. It's also a loss of being able to the relationships that we have with the people that we work with. And it's also a loss of our normal routine. We're used to getting up at a certain time, going to work a certain way, seeing the same people, whether it's our clients or our customers or the people that we work with. And so when that changes for whatever reason, we have to understand that that's a shift in our normal pattern of behavior, and that can create feelings of grief. And people might think, well, really? But especially with COVID, going through all of this that we're going through, it's this loss after loss after loss after loss after change after transition. And it's all happening in a really short period of time. So what's happening is we're adapting to the changes because we're resilient as human beings, but we're not healing from the emotional impact that these changes may be having for us.
I can respect that because a lot of people assume grief is just basically, to me, I've always thought maybe at one point it was just death. Death was grief. That was it. I never understood, as you mentioned, grief is just a change of a norm to a different, almost a different reality. And then the mere fact that I know you said we're resilient. Sorry, we are resilient. I find that I think it's giving too much credit to human beings. Because a lot of people have that mental, like I'm being honest. Like I see people out there and I'm just like way too much credit. And there's some that, they do have that, they can bounce back, right? But there's others that are gonna need like assistance from you, someone like you, to basically push past that moment as well as, find a way to grieve properly so they can heal. I think that makes sense in a sense.
Yeah. And I think what we have to really understand is that grief is not just deep sadness, which is what I think most people attribute grief to, but it's all these conflicting emotions. So it can be frustration and anger and bitterness and resentment and all these things that get wrapped up in this changing, transitioning experiences that we're all going to have as we go through life. Like we all experience loss many times in our lives. Loss is universal. but grief is personal because our relationship to the people or the experiences that we have are unique to us. So that's why sometimes someone might be able to go through an experience and there's not much of an emotional impact for them. But for someone else, there might be a greater emotional impact. And that might just be the last straw of many other emotional impacts that they've had from changing situations. So we never really know what's going on with people. And so that's why, like, I really am, one of the things that I'm really keen and passionate about is to open the conversations about, you know, how we are actually feeling in our lives. Because at the end of the day, very few of us had an adult that sat down with us as a child at the kitchen table and shared with us how to navigate the painful feelings that we're going to have as we go through this lifetime.
I'm sorry, people do that? People say, I don't remember that. People do that.
And no, and that's why. So we've never really been given the tools to be able to effectively deal with these transitions and changes that we're going to have in our life and the emotional impact of it. So we default to our logical mind most of the time. We try to understand it, figure it out, come up with solutions for it, which is great. But when there's an emotional impact, trying to use your head to heal your heart is the wrong tool for the job. It's like using a toothbrush to paint your room. It's ineffective and it's going to take a really, really long time.
So I know what you're saying. And when it comes to men itself, I think they've been taught not to show their feelings. And would you say society has contributed dramatically to how we think men should behave when dealing with any form of grief?
Yeah, you know what, this is such a interesting topic. And again, I'm so grateful that you're bringing it up because all of us, like, we're all human beings.
Okay.
So we use gender and age and sexual orientation and religion to separate ourselves from each other. But at the end of the day, we are all human beings. And so what happens is most of us grew up with these misconceptions around grief. And most of these misconceptions we heard very early on, and usually from people that we trusted, our parents, you know, our churches, our coaches, our teachers. You know, we heard it from adults that we trusted as young people, but sometimes they didn't have the correct information either. So the misconceptions that we learned early on, the first one is like, don't feel bad. And so, like, don't feel bad or don't cry, it's okay. But when we have a loss experience, it's not okay in that moment. And I think as young people, we learn to suppress and bury our emotions. And even though we all hear that, men and women both, men, I think, hear it in a different way. And the expectation from a socialization point of view is very different. So when we hear, you know, early on, they're going to hear things like big boys don't cry. And they don't just hear that from their dads and their uncles and the men in their life. They hear it from the women in their life too, their moms, right? Their sisters, their teachers. You know, big boys don't cry. If you're going to cry, I'll give you something to cry about, right? Or go to your room if you're going to cry, right? And then as they get older, it's like, man up, you know, don't be a, you know, P word and all these other things. So right from very early on, the messaging around them is, do not show your vulnerable emotions because to do so is weak. And that is a flawed premise. It's a totally flawed premise. And I know women who have also sat there with, that have said to me straight up, that have said, yeah, you know what, if my man cried in front of me, that I would think less of them, because we have also grown up with the people in our lives telling us, that socialization, that men are strong and they're stoic and they're emotionally controlled and they're unfeeling. It's not true. It's just that men have learned, even more so than women, to bury and suppress their feelings. And there's a danger to that.
Yes. That was my segue. And I think when you said they've learned, I find that they've used different source of outlet to express that. Like, I think, you know, would you say it's fair that the narrative has to change? Because I find it's very detrimental to our society and very dangerous, because you have a lot of abusive relationships, a lot of anger issues. Women are getting, like, unfortunately, men and women are getting killed, family situations, because they haven't been taught how to effectively deal with their emotions or let it out. And they use a form of, you know, masculine way of expressing and then think that's being strong.
Yeah, because that's what they've been taught to do, right? In some way, shape, or form, either through their own family relationships, growing up and observing what happened in their households, what happened in their communities around them, what's going on in society. So the the conversation needs to change. The narrative needs to change, because at the end of the day, what's happening is that men have just learned to suppress their emotions so much. But the thing is, you can't, grief doesn't go away, right? All that happens is, and really no emotion goes away. Emotions are meant to move through us. They're energy in motion. That's the actual word, right? So when we suppress painful emotions, so say grief, as an example here, what happens is it just gets buried. It doesn't go anywhere. But then with successive losses, if we don't effectively complete them emotionally, it just builds and builds. So now this energy, and we know when we get angry or when we're sad, like how big that emotion can feel, it's energy, right? So that energy is coming up within us. And because men have been taught it's not okay to cry, it's not okay to be vulnerable, that they will be embarrassed or emasculated if they show vulnerable emotions. What's the alternative to them? So even though anger is not necessarily acceptable, it's more acceptable in some people's viewpoint for a man to be angry than it is for him to be sad or lonely or upset or cry. And really, and the tears, remember, we've had this conversation before, you and I, tears are our body's natural way of releasing stress. Tears, they've shown, like reflexive tears when we cut an onion, is primarily just water. But tears that we cry through emotion have the toxic byproducts of stress. So tears are actually, tears are the way of your body of releasing some of that huge emotional energy that needs to happen. And so when men have been taught it's not okay to cry, you're denying them a biological way, a natural way for their body to actually release some of that pent up stress. So what happens is men end up showing grief through anger. Anger is a reflexive emotion, right? Underneath anger, there's always some other emotion, right? It's the first one that's on top. Yes. And it's often a built up of over and over. So it's almost like men have been denied the ability to move through their emotions in a natural way. And so they end up doing exactly what you said. They find different ways to cope because you need to find a way to cope through that. And so it's, studies show that men tend to, more so than women do the same too, but they do short-term energy relieving behaviors, we call it, in grief recovery. So it's activities or things that we do to help alleviate some of those painful emotions. And they do work in the short term, but all it's doing is kicking the can down the road for later. So what we find is that men tend to have more, they tend to go more towards alcohol, drugs, risk-taking behavior when they're feeling things like that. They're more prone than women to grieve alone or to isolate themselves, which is not a natural human tendency. That is a learned behavior. And they're just not allowed. And also men have a tendency, especially with loss of a spouse or in a relationship, more so to commit suicide than women would in that circumstance.
But they take us with them. They usually take us with them. Like I've seen men that they take the women or the kids with them. Like the family annihilators, those are really just, they scare me.
And that can be a situation that's gone beyond grief. There can be other pathological issues as a result of that, other mental health issues that are a part of that, addiction issues that can be a part of that. But at the end of the day, so the scope of what I'm dealing with in terms of helping people that are moving through those natural losses that we're going to experience in life, it's being able to get to the root. And we're just not used to doing it. And it's a tougher conversation for men because they've never been given an opportunity to honestly express their emotions in a place where they feel safe and trust the person that they can share that emotion with without feeling that they're going to be emasculated or embarrassed or shamed for having that natural emotion.
I like that because For me, I'm so used to having, like in my previous relationship, I've had guys that are very more stoic, like they don't show emotions. And mine, my current one, shows a lot more emotions. So he does. And it's I'm self-aware of the fact that sometimes I'm just like, why are you acting like this? I don't get it. But then I'm like, this is normal. You deserve to be treated that way. That's someone's supposed to want to talk to you. So like he's a lot more healthier
Yes,
mentally
I was
wise.
just going to say that that's a healthy
Yeah.
relationship. And it's us too, as women, we have to be aware of what our judgment is for
Yes.
men that show up authentically, truthfully, honestly as themselves in that moment. And catch ourselves because of our own bias and the things that we've learned, right? So when we don't have the effective tools,
Then
then
how?
how are
Yeah.
we going to be able to hear people? And this is the thing, we all have pain, like we're all human beings, right? And pain will happen to us throughout our lifetime. It's part of being human. And so trying to avoid it is only going to kick, like I said, kick the can down the road. And there will be impact at some point. And now some of us are really good, and I will own it, because some of these misconceptions, and I'll just quickly go over them. The first one was don't feel bad. Replacing the loss, which means, we learn to replace people and things without actually completing the original relationship. So it's a rock in the backpack that we just carry on into the next relationship. Grieving alone, right? Which isolation, as I mentioned, is a learned behavior. It is not a natural human tendency. When something great happens to us, we want to share that with people. And when something terrible happens to us, we also want to be able to share that with
Fair
people.
enough.
Being strong. And so I will say this, the grieve alone and be strong, those two were mine. Like I went through the majority of my adult life believing in those misconceptions. I was a police officer for 18 years. I was a personal trainer for 8 years. So, I was very masculine in my approach to grief. And I think there's a lot of women that were that whole sort of stoic, I've got to be the strong one. People are looking to me to be the guide. And really what I've learned is that you can be strong or you can be human. And it actually it's a courageous act of bravery to be vulnerable and show up with your honest,
It's
natural
it's
human emotion.
scary. It's
It
honestly
is
scary.
scary.
It's 100% scary. And I remember I used to be a lot more close knit. I used to not show my emotions. And I think for me personally, on a personal level, if it wasn't for my boyfriend, I think I'd be a little more standoffish. Like having a conversation like you with Kirsten, like right now, I would be open to that because I'd still be like, a wall,
Yeah.
and then not letting my wall down and understanding that, there's different ways of interacting with someone and there's some ways of feeling good about yourself and being open and being emotional. Like sadly, I'm just thinking sadly, I had to have a man show me how to be emotional.
Now, how ironic is
No,
that?
I just realized.
Yep, I love it. Everything you said there was pure gold. Like
Oh
there were
my
so many juicy nuggets in what you just shared there, Mo. And one of the things that I really, so kudos to your boyfriend,
God. Don't say that. Hey, he
because
records it. He edits this. No kudos to you.
kudos to him, because him being able to show up authentically as he is,
Mm-hmm.
happy, sad, whatever, all the gamut, a full range of human emotions that he has stood as an example for not only
100%.
the men in his life, but also for the women in his life, including you, to be able to do the same. So yeah, it
Yes.
might feel weird and uncomfortable
Oh,
for us
it
if we're
is.
not used to that. And you talked about like that wall. It's a heart wall that we have built up over hurt and pain and little losses and big losses and all these things that have happened. We have built that wall to protect our hearts from getting hurt
100%.
again. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really keep us from doing that. It keeps us actually from the trust and the empathy and the love and the support that we need in those moments. The key is that we have to be able to talk to people that we trust. Not
Yes.
everybody deserves to hear your story. And to be emotional doesn't mean that you're crying all the time. Some people cry, some people don't. But you can still feel sad and not have tears. right? So it's just being able to listen to people with an open heart and an open mind. And just because at the end of the day, we want to fix things, right? We want to help, we want to fix what's wrong. And the truth of the matter is we cannot fix it. And it's not up to us. That is not our responsibility to fix it. But we can show up as a human being and be compassionate and be empathetic to someone who is in a moment of loss. Because the more we practice doing that, the more now we are able to have these kinds of conversations. And it's not this weird kind of awkward, conversation that people are not having. But then we end up with the past effects, people that are trying to manage their painful feelings with drugs or alcohol, gambling, online shopping, overworking, working out to like an imbalanced way of acting, taking risk-taking behaviors, suicide. Like these things are legitimate problems in our society, and our young people are also being affected. So when we can have this conversation and shift from those misconceptions that we've had and open up the discussion so that the boys in our life, the men in our life, so I'm a mother and of a 22-year-old son, and I am also a wife. And so we live together and we see these things. And, prior to me taking my own grief journey and healing my own heart, I couldn't have had these conversations either, Mo. I would have been judging from a different place or be very critical or analyzing it, like using again my logical mind. And by doing this work, what has happened is that heart wall has come down. I'm okay sitting with the uncomfortable conversation. I'm okay to sit with the pain, right? Someone else's pain and not feel like I need to fix it, because there's nothing wrong with them. They don't need to be fixed. There is nothing broken. They are only in pain. And there's something to be learned from the painful emotions that we go through. There's something to be learned. It's not for me to take that learning or that awareness away from someone, but it can help to sit in the dark with them and show them that there's a way out.
I see that. And I think it depends on the person, because I'm thinking myself mentally, a few people, I think they need that kind of conversation, but some people are not ready. Like even, some people are not ready, and you can't force it on somebody.
Thank you for joining us today on our weekly episode of Health Your Way podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, share with others, and please feel free to comment below and ask any questions on topics we discussed, as well as future topics you'd like to hear about. Have a happy and healthy week, and be sure to tune in next week for the next episode on our Health Your Way podcast.